the last video I was talking about this book here, Salt, Sugar, Fat by Michael Moss. And in that video I touched specifically on the topic of sugar. In this one I will talk about fat and salt. So are you curious in knowing what those big companies do in their products in order to make us hooked? If yes, keep watching. In this book, the author Michael Moss describes fat as a opiate in foods. Yes, you heard me right, opiate. Am I pronouncing it right? Fat can then be described as the opiate in foods because it acts as a smooth operator whose effects are less obvious but no less powerful than sugar. In fact, like sugar, when we eat fat, our brains lights up the reward system. That means that every time that we are eating fatty food, our reward system say, alright Thiago, keep eating because that food is good for you. That was the truth a couple of thousand years ago, or maybe 200 years ago even, when you didn't know when you would have the next meal. But nowadays fat can be a problem, especially in processed foods. But we'll talk about that in a second. First, one thing that you need to know is that sugar or carbohydrates have around 4 calories per gram. But with fat, that's more than double, because fat per every gram has 9 calories. But fat by itself is not a problem, not at all. Fat is actually a good thing that we all need. The real problem in fat on the processed foods are the following. Usually they use cheap fats that are not good for us when eating in excess, that most of us eat. And the other one is that our brain doesn't recognize solid fat as being fat as quickly as should. But let's touch on that point. What the scientists found out is that when we eat fat on processed foods that melts down very quickly, our brain doesn't recognize it as a fat. And basically, like popcorn, we are able to keep eating and eating and eating and not feel full. The term for that is called vanishing caloric density. So we already have 2 problems here with fat on processed foods. Most of them are not healthy, and if you want to know basically a quick reason for that is because they are mostly rich in omega-6. And what happens with most people is that we eat way more omega-6 than omega-3. And if we don't have a ratio, a good balance between them, that starts to cause a lot of issues in our health. And the other one, basically I was saying that our brain doesn't recognize the fat that melts down quickly as fat. After a few studies, scientists also found out that we can tolerate way more fat than sugar. We can have too much sugar in a product. So for example, if we add a lot of sugar in a product, after a certain amount, you just can't eat it. You can barely touch it because there's a lot of sugar. That happens with me sometimes when I try to eat some Indian desserts. Anyway. Another thing that scientists figured out, it was a way to make us really not realize how much fat we are eating. And the way they do that is very simple. They just add sugar in fat-rich products. So for example, let's pick up potato chips. It's a good one. Sometimes potato chips have sugar on it. Did you know? Yes, that's true. And the reason why they do that is because they want you to eat more and more of it and not realize the amount of fat that you are eating. So what they do is they add some sugar on it and our body really loses the ability to know how much fat it contains on it. So I think you already know enough about what they do with fat. If you read the book, for example, there you will find out some stories of what companies did on the 80s when fat was considered like the cause for obesity, and the companies were producing milk, started to produce skim milk, and they didn't know what to do with the fat. Basically what they did it was to put that fat in cheese and other products. But for that, read the book. Now let's talk about salt. And by salt I mean sodium. I will use the word salt because it's the word that is more commonly used. But usually the problem is sodium and not the salt. But let's get to what is important here. First fact for you. Did you know that we are not born liking salt? Yes, that's true. We don't like salt when we are born, but we are designed to like it, and that's very easy, especially nowadays with the amount of processed foods that parents give to their kids and sometimes even the amount of salt that they have on the food. We just start to crave it, a lot of it, even when we are young. And that can be very bad because the more you eat, the more you want. One of the problems that we all know around sodium is that sodium pulls fluids from the tissues into the blood, which raises the blood volume and compels the heart to pump more forcefully. And the result, we all know what it is. It's high blood pressure. But that's the only one sign of eating too much sodium. because usually along the way it comes a lot of other problems. But getting back to when we are kids, let me share this with you. And I'm pretty sure that if you start to think, somehow you will realize this. Another thing that scientists found out is that black people, especially teenagers, the kids, they prefer salty foods compared to white people that prefer more sugar foods. And that's, for me, it's very interesting, because you see a lot of black kids eating more sodium foods. At least when I start to think, yeah, like they go more to KFC, they eat more potato chips and other things, while at least in my reality, I see white kids eating more foods that are rich in sugar. Anyway, just sharing this with you. But I also want to make this point very clear. Sodium is not a bad thing. Like fat, having a little bit of it, or at least a certain amount, it's actually beneficial for our health. Another thing that I learned reading this book is that we also have taste buds that recognize salt all the way from our mouth to our gut, like sugar. Another thing that I found interesting, and I never tried, probably neither you, is that eating processed foods without salt is disgusting, like completely. The author shared some stories with us where he's given to taste some of those products without salt. He says that it's horrible. Those products without salt have a very acidic taste, and the only way to make them desirable is by adding salt and fat. So companies do what they have to do in order to sell, because if they don't sell, they are out of the market. Now, sharing all this with you, I don't want you to think that sugar by itself is a bad thing, that fat by itself is a bad thing, neither sodium. It's not. For that, future videos on this channel will be made, and if you don't know why they are not bad, you will learn. So subscribe to the channel, and when I will post those videos, you will have a notification in your subscriptions tab. But let's finish this video with a tip. For example, if you are someone who struggles to eat foods that don't have that much salt, you always feel that you have to add salt, otherwise you can't eat food. That's normal, because like pretty much everything, our body starts to tolerate the amount that you have. The good news is that you can reverse that. But how can you stop eating salt and just say, oh my god, this tastes horrible? There is two solutions for that. For real. If you want to cut salt in your diet, which probably is not a bad thing is if you eat a little bit of processed foods, is to add fresh herbs and spices in your foods. And I will repeat, fresh. Because sometimes there are some spices that you add on food that are not fresh. You really have to add a lot of them in order to not feel the desire to eat salt. And on top of that, there are some companies who add salt on the spices in order for you to really like them, which doesn't make any sense. If you are trying to cut salt by adding salt without knowing, it's the same stuff. By adding fresh herbs and fresh spices, I can guarantee you that slowly you will start to have less desire to eat a very large amount of salt. So my Brazilian friends, I know that you put a lot of salt on food. If you really have the desire to cut it, try this little tip and see if it helps. Alright guys, that's it for this video. So we discussed fat, sugar and salt. And now you know what companies are doing in order to make us hooked to want to have those products, why they are so good. You now know what is the bliss point, you know that they use a lot of formulas, you know that processed foods without sodium taste horribly, you know that they put sugar on fatty foods because that way we don't recognize the amount of fat that actually a product has, and many other things. But don't think this is the end, because the best part is coming tomorrow. So keep your eyes on the channel. See you.